Thank you very much. Thank you. It is great to be here. It's first time here for me, and what a facility this is. It really is spectacular. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out on this gorgeous day. And I think we're gonna take questions too, right? You got some cards?
We already
for
have
questions?
some questions,
Okay, good.
which we'll get to. So listen, the Freedom Forum has made a concerted effort to travel the country, hear from people about their thoughts on the First Amendment, how they use it in their daily lives. You anchor from Washington, D.C. every night. You live there, but I know you get around as much as you can. What for you is like the importance of traveling to different parts of America in your job? How does it kind of affect your reporting?
Well, I think it's really important for us to get outside of the bubble of either Washington or New York or the coasts and see real people in real places like Union City, Tennessee. I mean, it is important to get outside talking about polls and how people say they answer polls, to really talk to people in different places about issues that they care about. And without that, I think there's a real disconnect in the way that we cover things. And part of the First Amendment is realizing that it is speech, it is religion, it is press, it is assembly, it's the right to petition the government, it's all of those things. And for the press to work effectively, we need to get out and about to the different parts of the country to make sure that we're representing what we see around the country. So I think especially as we get towards elections, my job is to get out and about and talk to people in diners and places and just ask them what they think about things.
Let's talk about your background a bit. What drew you to journalism, and what's the path that sort of led you to Fox News?
So I was born in New Jersey, but I grew up in Atlanta, and I went to high school in Atlanta, and I interned at WSB in Atlanta for Ernie Johnson Jr., who's now on TNT with the NBA coverage. He was the sports guy at Channel 2 in Atlanta, and I interned with him. And when I went there, I kind of looked over and said, you know, the news guys, they look really interesting. And I started thinking that's what I wanted to do. I was the editor of the paper in high school. I was a ham. I was in acting. I played golf. But I knew that I wanted to get into news. So I interned at CNN. Yes, I did. Yes, I know it's hard to believe. You're shaking your head. No. And I worked for Bernard Shaw, the late Bernard Shaw, who just recently passed. And he was a fantastic mentor. I learned a lot from him. One of the founders kind of the journalism anchors of that time. You remember the Gulf War when he was over in Iraq. Just a funny story. I used to get him his popcorn. He ate popcorn during the show. And so I would deliver the popcorn to the set. And years later, when I took over for Bret Hume, he said, I saw him and I said, you know, I interned for you. I used to get your popcorn. And he looked at me in that baritone voice and said, who gets you your popcorn now? You know? And popcorn's a horrible snack during a show, by the way. I don't do popcorn. But I really became into the news and decided that's what I was going to do. I studied political science and English. I then went to a small market in Beaufort, South Carolina. I was the Hilton Head bureau guy. I was a one-man band. I was the photographer and the reporter and the editor, and I covered huge stories like loggerhead sea turtle nesting and what color the azaleas were in the median. And I also bartended at Applebee's, and I delivered food, okay? So I turned in my story at about 3 p.m. every day, and then I went to my night job to try to make ends meet. And as I'm delivering food, I go to a door, and I knock on the door, and they say, wait a second, aren't you the reporter on Channel 6? And I'd say, yes. Did you order the calzone? And that's how I started my career. I went from there to Rockford, Illinois, an NBC affiliate. There was a lot of crime, a lot of different stories there. I was in Rockford for 10 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Really loved Rockford. Then I went from there to Burlington, Vermont, and then I went to Raleigh, North Carolina, a CBS affiliate, WRAL, which is actually a big powerhouse down there. And my first day, I went to cover a story at UNC, University of North Carolina, about Title IX. And as we were there, this is about women's sports, we get news on the radio that a tornado is going to hit this trailer park nearby. So my photographer and I, we get in the car, we race, and we see the tornado on the highway. And we get to the trailer park right afterwards. Fortunately, nobody died. They weren't hurt, but there was a lot of devastation. And we started taking pictures and video. And then we get news on the radio that another tornado is going to hit the same spot. So we run with the firefighters and the police into a ditch as we're rolling the camera. And the tornado passes about a half mile away. And again, fortunately, nobody was hurt. But that video became national. And that next day, not only did I do a story for WRAL, but I did stories for CBS affiliates around the country about that tornado and the video about running away from it. So the next day, just a quick story, I talk about small town America. I was doing a follow-up, and right next door to where the tornado hit was a little town called Lizard Lick, North Carolina. Lizard Lick had one stop sign and one diner. And just to tell you, the powerhouse of WRAL TV, Channel 5, I walk through the diner door, and there are 6 guys with big bellies at the diner. And they turn and look at me as I walk in. They say, "Hey, Bret." I had been there one day. And I said, WRAL is a big powerhouse TV station. So I left WRAL and I started with this startup Fox News channel. And the Atlanta bureau for Fox News started in my apartment with a fax machine and a cell phone. And I covered the Southeast and South and Central America, bounced around with a photographer, and fed up stories to the mothership in New York. And I'd go all over the place. I was in Arkansas, and I flew into Little Rock. And I remember the day it happened. I got off the plane, and this woman came up to me and said, "Wait, you're on Fox News." And I said, yeah, I am. And she said, "I love your channel because you report and I decide." And I called marketing and said, "It's working." That's when I knew we had crossed the thing. I covered all kinds of stories. I covered tornadoes. I covered hurricanes, 17 named storms. I bounced around, covered the Elian Gonzalez case down in Cuba, and then the recount in Tallahassee in 2000. And that's when I really fell in love with trying to get to the bottom of being fair with political coverage. And my mentor and friend, Bret, I really loved being on his show, Special Report, and I told him that all the time. So I tried to do more and more political stories around the Southeast. And then 9/11 happened. Yeah. And that changed the entire thing.
Yeah, right. So you have your show now. It's at 5 o'clock Central here in Tennessee. And, you know, so you're behind the desk at 5 o'clock. But I'm guessing there's not a typical day besides you having to be there at 5 o'clock. So walk us through, if there is a typical day, like what goes on in your day?
Yeah, it's not typical, but we have things that happen. In the morning, I usually do radio hits for Fox Radio around the country, and I get a download about what happened overnight from a thing we call the Brain Room, which sends us this consolidation of all the stories around the world. And then I have a morning meeting at 10 a.m. With my staff, and we start talking about how the show is going to come together. But it's bottom up about what they're covering. You know, we listen to the different bureaus around the country and around Washington, and then the normal day is usually not normal. It changes about 5 or 6 times, and the best days are when it changes just before 5 o'clock your time, and we rip up the rundown and we do something live because that means there's real news that's happening at that time. Our biggest challenge is to fit it into 1 hour because we're trying to, it's like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much information that comes at you. We're trying to give you guys the best summation of what's happening around the world and in the U.S. on Special Report. So we like to call ourselves the last news show. Obviously, there's some great shows that are opinion programs that's like an opinion page in a newspaper and a news program. But ideally, at the end of Special Report, you come away thinking, I have a good sense about what's happening in the U.S. and around the world. And that's the deal. Let me just finish my little thing about 9/11.
Yeah.
So 9/11, I am in the Atlanta Bureau, and the first plane hits the first building in New York. And I get called to back up in New York as a reporter for Fox affiliates around the country. And we start getting our stuff together to catch a plane, and then the second plane hits. And they say, we need you in a car right now. So a producer and myself get in the car, we start driving. And we're outside Atlanta a bit, and the third plane hits. And they reroute us to the Pentagon. And I start doing live reports outside the burning Pentagon that night for Fox affiliates around the country. I do that for a week, and I then never left. They asked me to be the national security correspondent, and the next day, I was on a plane with then Defense Secretary Rumsfeld overseas as he's making the case for war in Afghanistan. So I had a satellite phone, and I told a friend of mine I was in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and I said, I need you to find me an apartment. And he found me an apartment in Washington, D.C. And so I do want to give you a piece of advice. If you get called on a business trip, before you go, do the dishes. Because what happened was they packed up my stuff in Atlanta. I get back from this world trip with then Defense Secretary Rumsfeld. I go into my new apartment with all these boxes, and then I open them up, and it's like an archaeological dig. I've got plates that still had chicken on them. And the guys who were packing just packed it all. So anyway, I never left Washington. That became my home from that point on. I covered the Pentagon for 6.5 years, traveled with the military, embedded with the military along the Afghan-Pakistan border, went to Iraq and Afghanistan 13 and 12 times, ended up going to 74 countries, reporting from 74 different countries. I was there for 6.5 years, then became chief White House correspondent for the second term under George W. Bush. And then I took over for Bret, as I mentioned, my mentor and friend, January 5th, 2009. And it's been an amazing ride since.
You mentioned 9/11, and I think that's obviously a moment in history where everyone remembers exactly where you are when it happened. What are some other moments in your news career what are some of the biggest stories that you consider you've covered?
I mean, some of the biggest really deal with the military, because I don't think until I was immersed in it that I had a full appreciation of the service and sacrifice of the men and women of the U.S. military. How many people here either served or have a family member who've served? Wow. Thank you for your service to the country. Some of the biggest moments, I really do believe, are that interaction. I'll give you two quick stories. One was I was flying into Baghdad on a C-17, and we get on, and we're in the C-17, and the pilots say, why don't you come up front and we can see us land. And I said, sure. So I go up front to the pilots in the C-17, this big, big plane. And as we're landing, we're doing a corkscrew landing into Baghdad to avoid surface-to-air missiles. And this pilot touches his jacket 3 times. And we land. We're there for a number of hours, and after we fly out to go to Amman, Jordan, and we're taking off, they put me back in the cockpit, and he touches his jacket 3 times. And I said, what is that? Is that a signal to your co-pilot? And he said, no. And he went into his jacket and he pulled out his 3-year-old son. He said, I just want to know that I touched him either when I'm taking off or when I'm landing, every time. And to that point, I was embedded in Afghanistan, and I was along the Afghan-Pakistan border, and it was the early days of Skype, where you could communicate with your family members or whoever in the computer. So I'd come back from being with these guys as they were taking out Al-Qaeda coming across the path there, and next to me is a guy that is talking to his wife, and he is meeting his baby son for the first time over the computer. I'm talking to Fox about the story I'm working on, and he's crying, and the wife's crying, and the baby's crying, I'm crying, and you just get a sense of the importance of the job that they do, not only overseas, but the job that the families do back home to make sure that we can all sit here and talk about the First Amendment in a sweltering hot Union City. I'm sorry that you're still hot there in the sunshine, but it is important to give props to the U.S. military and those families.
Well, let's stay with the. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. Let's stay with the First Amendment. We're here at Discovery Park celebrating First Amendment Festival, and I'd like to talk now about how it guides your work. You interviewed presidents, congressional leaders, world leaders, and so many others, and you're often asking the tough questions. So I'm curious, the role of the First Amendment and freedom of the press plays in your reporting.
It is really important in my job to be able to question leaders like that, to be able to be pointed but fair to the leader of the country, to leaders of the country. Senator Blackburn is here somewhere. Thank you for your service, ma'am. But she's been on the back end of tough interviews, and because you can ask tough questions, be fair, respectful, that is what the First Amendment from a press point of view is, and it's really, really important. You talk about freedom of religion and how that plays across our country and how important that is. I'm in the process of writing a book called To Rescue the Constitution, George Washington and the Convention that Saved the American Spirit. It's about the stories of the Founding Fathers and how they put together the Constitution. And there was a real debate back then whether rights and human rights should be a part of it. In fact, there was a battle in the Constitutional Convention. Madison was really against it, but there was a sense that it was really important, especially the smaller states believed that. George Washington ended all the discussion. When they said he was going to be president, he said in his inaugural address that there will be a Bill of Rights, and that will be proposed, voted on, and then put forward. And it came out in 1791. That's how the first 10 make the Bill of Rights that we know today. That moment really changed the whole American experiment. And if you look from that point on, where we as a country are, any president, when it goes overseas, the First Amendment is the thing that is waved high. In the book I wrote about Reagan, the book is called 3 Days in Moscow. It dealt with the negotiation between Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan. But one time he gets invited to Moscow towards the end of those negotiations about nuclear discussions. And he's invited to speak at Moscow State University with these Soviet Union kids. And Reagan goes there, and there's a big bust of Lenin over his podium where he's speaking, and the White House officials are freaking out, and Reagan says, well, let's do this. And he moves forward with the speech, and what he delivers to these Soviet Union kids is why freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly is so important. In the heart of communism, he delivers that speech. He would not live to see the wall come down. He would not see it as president, it would be George H.W. Bush. But that speech and that, waiving the First Amendment really made a major difference. And I think any moment, big moment, you can point back to the First Amendment in America's history. That's why it's so important for everybody around the country to understand that it's not about everybody else has the First Amendment, it's you have the First Amendment, the freedom to speech, the freedom to religion, assembly, petition the government.
I have our first audience question, and it's,
Yeah.
Why is it so hard for this country to have debates anymore? And I don't know if that means debates among each other or political debates, but take that question as you will.
I think it may, I'll interpret it, I'll say it both ways. One is to have debates where you differ in opinion why is that so hard? You know, I do think social media has made it tougher. It seems that it has supercharged some of the feelings about things, and sometimes people feel like they can sit in their basement and type off a tweet or a Facebook message without repercussions, and sometimes it gets very heated that way. I mean, you can look at my Twitter feed and see that, but I think it's really important to have people come together from different points of view and talk about things, and to listen first, to listen to each other first, even if you disagree, to listen first. The best thing about, you know, everybody says Washington is broken, and there's a lot of elements of Washington that are broken. But Senator Blackburn and others would tell you that she works across the aisle with Democrats that you don't hear about a lot to get legislation through. And so what I'm trying to do is bring forward some of that story on my show. So we started a new segment called Common Ground last month. And so once a week I get people from the left and the right, maybe it's two lawmakers from different sides, who the first question is, what's the common ground? What can you guys get behind together? You know, President Eisenhower was arguably our most bipartisan president. And he said, if we could just get the stuff that we agree on done first, and then argue about the stuff we don't, we'd be a much better country. And I think that, you know, we as a country would be good to listen first to each other. And it's a big, big issue. But one of the issues that makes that way is social media and some of the vitriol that comes out of that.
The Freedom Forum's recent survey, Where America Stands, shows that 63% of respondents say it is important for the press to be a watchdog on government, but just 37% say the press does a good job with the role, and further, just 14% of Americans trust journalists. So I'm curious on your reaction to those results, and are there ways that the news media can, you know, change perceptions of the profession?
Yeah, I think it's disheartening a little bit. Obviously, reporters are not considered very well in any poll that you ask. I think that there is more a sense that people want to hear what they want to hear, and so they go to places that tell them what they want to hear. I think it would be better for us overall if there were more news programs, but you know, different places have decided different things. I think, you know, there is real balance that you can get to by covering things, but there's a real issue in the news media to be able to do that fairly. And when some of our colleagues go one way and then groupthink about something, for us, it's actually fantastic because it provides a lane where we say, listen, we are giving you all sides, and there are a lot of people that are not. It's easy. It's kind of low-hanging fruit for us. There's a lot of stories like that sometimes they're just not even covered as issues. So I understand where that perception is coming from. I'm trying to be the place, at least on Fox, where people could go and say, it was fair. I tell people to watch Special Report 3 times and drop me an email and tell me what you think. Yeah. Democrat, Republican, Independent, and if it was fair. And the people who do it actually get back to us and say, yeah, we think you're actually fair.
What types of you know, news sources do you read, you know, listen to, watch on a regular basis? Yeah,
I tell people that if you can digest and read as much as you can from different points of view. As I mentioned, I get this consolidation of all kinds of news, and I can dig down into it in this thing. Not everybody has a brain room to be able to do that and send an email, but you can go online and read different things. The thing I warn people about is just not believing something you see online automatically. My job, really, a lot of it, is to be an ice hockey goalie of news. In other words, I'm trying to prevent the bad pucks from getting through. And there's a lot of bad pucks when it comes to information out there. So what I say to people is, if you see something, It may actually be really true. If it's from a trusted place that you've found to be trusted before, go for it. But if it's not, and it sounds a little out there, it may be. And we do that every day. Today, there was something online that was said the president of China had been arrested, and there was a coup going on in Beijing. And that was floating around the internet. And as of today, we can't figure that out. But we don't have really a lot of eyes on in Beijing because it's not a place that the First Amendment is thriving.
Right.
It's not. There is no First Amendment in Beijing, China.
We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I thought I'd ask you to expand on it a bit. And it's a question I know you've gotten before, and that's about your network and how distinctions are made between what people might see during prime time and as opposed to the hard news reported during the day, including your show at 5 o'clock. So, do you think viewers make the distinction between the opinion and the hard news?
I do. I mean, I think that the difference between Special Report and Tucker's show or Special Report and Sean's show, people can see, for themselves. I think people, just like a newspaper has a news section and an opinion page, that's what we have. Now, the opinion folks do an amazing job about what they do, the stories they bring up. They sometimes stir the pot about different issues, and they get a lot of attention and great ratings. We work under the same umbrella of a company, but we do very different things. And sometimes, people paint with a broad brush, but there's a very robust news department at Fox that is trying to dig stories out. Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon, Peter Doocy at the White House, a lot of folks trying to do different things and challenge what we're hearing from government leaders, truth to power. We've been doing it for both administrations. We did it in Trump administration. Before that, the Obama administration. I did an interview with President Obama that got a little contentious over health care and Obamacare, but we have the ability to have Democrats and Republicans on, and it's a different animal, but we do work for the same company, and so I think it's easy for people to determine the difference. I hope it is, and I'm friends with all those guys.
Speaking of Biden and Trump and Obama, you've covered the last 4, I guess, presidential administrations.
So I've interviewed Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and I ask every week to interview President Biden, but we have not gotten a response on that yet.
Well, that kind of leads to my next question. Like, what are some of the biggest challenges covering any administration? Is it access or?
Access is a big challenge for the press. It's always something that we try to get. This president has been unique. He's not had a lot of interviews one-on-one. His first one, most recently, was with 60 Minutes, but that was the first one-on-one interview he'd had in 210 days. He's not done a lot as far as press conferences and interaction, so we're always pressing for more access. All networks are. That's really the biggest challenge. Sometimes covering the White House, you have to go outside the White House to get the real story because it's a little bit spoon-fed from the podium. But fortunately, we've had some good people, Jackie Heinrich and Peter Doocy, asking pointed questions that can advance the ball and keep them on our toes.
Let's get to your book.
Yeah.
Your latest book. It's To Rescue the Republic. Ulysses S. Grant, The Fragile Union and the Crisis of 1876, which chronicles the end of the Grant administration and how he faced a crisis on the 1876 election that threatened to undo his life's work, really. So tell us a little bit about this project, how it came to be.
This is the 4th presidential book that I worked on. The first book I did was called Special Heart. It was about my son Paul's journey with congenital heart disease. And he's doing fantastic, by the way. He's 6'2" and a half. I mean, I'm looking up to him. He's had 4 open heart surgeries and 10 angioplasties, and he's doing fantastic. So I got a lot of people, that sent in prayers and everything. That was the first book. But I wanted to get into history. I went into Eisenhower, and because I didn't know President Eisenhower, I knew General Eisenhower. And that started this love. That was called 3 Days in January. Then I mentioned the Reagan book, 3 Days in Moscow. And then I did 3 Days at the Brink, which was FDR, Churchill, and Stalin at the beginning of World War II. It's a meeting, a conference in Tehran where they planned D-Day. Anyway, these are moments that were largely overlooked in history. And I have an amazing researcher who would get these nuggets that had never been out there. And we compiled them into these stories that hopefully were readable and interesting, not only for my generation and older, but more importantly for younger people to really plug into history. So I left the 3 Days series and decided to search out another thing that was overlooked in history, and that was the Grant presidency. Everybody remembers General Grant from the Union Army, but little had been said about the Grant presidency other than big tomes of books of history kind of text. So we really dug in and found out that Grant was an amazing president that held the country together at a time when the war was going to raise its head again. There was going to be a second Civil War. And were it not for Ulysses S. Grant, this country may not have held together, really. So this goes into that, and really his standing in historians' look of presidents has gone up. He's now number 10 in how historians look at presidents of the United States. So I really dug in, and I think, unveiled a different part of Ulysses S. Grant, and especially the 1876 election.
And you opened the book on January 6th of 2021. So talk to us a little bit about the parallels with that day and what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was finishing the book, and I was looking to write a contemporary open, and that happened to happen at that time. And I was covering that day, and I describe it in the open to the book, of covering that moment. And for all the people that said that our country was on the brink of falling apart that day, I think you need some historical perspective to what happened in 1876. January 6th was a very dark day, and one of the darkest in Washington for that moment. But history will tell you that the country held together, the Congress came back, they certified the election, and the country went on. 1876 was much more precarious. But I wanted to start the book in a contemporary way that linked those two things to give some perspective.
Tell us about your experiences on January 6th. I know this was during the pandemic, and you were reporting from home, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was, so home studios were the thing because we were all separate from the studios. So I was covering January 6th really through a television screen in a living room with a camera and a backdrop that looks like a newsroom, but it's really just a 75-inch TV where there's a rotating video. And if you looked real closely, every 30 seconds, a woman would eat a sandwich over my shoulder because she was on a loop of a video. But anyway, I was covering it, and then all the craziness unfolded, and then I just stayed and then made phone calls there from the living room to congressmen, to lawmakers, to all kinds of people, authorities, law enforcement authorities, and reported that on the air from the COVID-confined studio inside my house.
Well, that actually leads to kind of my next audience question, and it's 6 simple words. How do you do so much? So yeah, where do you get time to kind of write these books and still do your day job?
So I write at night, and I usually put aside 2 hours when I'm in the middle of a project a night after I get home. It usually includes a glass of wine, and it may have to include one of the glasses of wine from this place. It's very nice.
Yeah,
a nice little glass of wine. And so I just put aside the time. And I think that this is the time for for me to put the pedal to the metal. And eventually there's going to be a slowdown, but my wife says, when is that happening? We have a lot to cover. The day job is very busy, and we're trying to make sure we cover all the major news. The election coming up, I'll bounce around the country, and looking forward to it. We're going to hopefully have some town halls and debates in different big election races that you guys, I think, will find very interesting.
Just one last question on the book. It's your another book chronicling a particular moment in American history, and maybe you touched on this a little bit, but what draws you to American history, and how does that affect sort of your everyday reporting, or does it?
It does. I think that we can all learn from history. We've oftentimes been there before, so we as a country could learn from our past. I think more and more lawmakers should go back and look at what the Constitution and the founders were thinking at the beginning as they look at what they're doing today. So hopefully this next book about the Constitution will kind of lay that groundwork. I think, the best success that I had was I gave a speech at the Reagan Library about the last of the 3 Days books, the FDR, Churchill, and Stalin book, 3 Days at the Brink. And after I finished, I did a book signing, and a teacher, an 8th grade teacher, came up to me and said, Bret, I want you to know that this semester I have a 3 days class. We're doing all 3 books, Eisenhower, Reagan, and the FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. So I said, wow, because it was the beginning, middle, and end of the Cold War. And so that next week, I Zoomed into that class, and we did Q&A with the 8th grade kids. And that was what I was really trying to do with all these books, is to be able to do that and to have this hunger for history for younger people, because we could really learn a lot as a country. We have a rich history that we should all embrace.
Speaking of history class, a couple more questions from the audience, and these are kind of civics questions, so I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, Bret.
Okay.
This question is, who has the authority to amend the Constitution?
You all do. The voters do. And you have the vote. 2/3 vote from the states can do it. And it has to be launched in a process, and it can be done. It hasn't been done in a long, long time, but the power is with the people, which is a lot of times forgotten in all the look about what's happening in Washington.
Okay, next civics question from the audience. Explain the difference between a democracy and a republic.
It's a great question. We often get confused. We are not technically a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. We elect people to represent us in Congress, and they vote for us. A pure democracy is where the people straight up vote by a popular vote. That is not where we are. We are technically a constitutional republic. But we often talk about democracy and the importance of democracy, because every vote matters, and that's the essence of democracy. But the structure of government is called a constitutional republic.
Good answer.
All right, so you can say yes?
Yes. You're correct. Correct, sir, yeah. And now for something completely different.
Okay.
Another question from the audience. Are drag queen shows in public parks permissible under the First Amendment?
Okay, let me rewind that one.
Okay.
Are drag queen shows in public parks permissible under the First Amendment? Yes,
Okay.
they would be permissible under the First Amendment. However, if there are rules at certain parks, I suppose they would be able to put stipulations about what kind of shows could be had. But technically, yes,
Okay.
they would be.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for those questions, audience. Really, really great stuff.
Yeah.
Just have a few more minutes left, and I want to again bring up the midterms coming up, and we just discuss the political divide in this country. There is such polarization. So I just kind of want to get your thoughts on this polarization, and how we can overcome them. I mean, I know it's not a simple question, or there's not a simple answer, but what are just some of your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it takes leadership. It takes real leadership to get past some of the biggest divides. And there are passions on both sides, and we shouldn't take away the passion. It doesn't mean that you can't be passionate. It means that that we have to elect people that represent us and trust that they're going to fight the fight in Congress. What people do a lot of times is when they get angry that stuff is not happening, they unplug, or they don't vote, or they decide that that's not something they want to do. More engagement rather than less is how the country gets better. And that's what we try to, cover in covering Washington, but getting outside of Washington and make sure that people know that there are really good things happening in the country. Inherently, we are good people. And we should kind of go with that, in that optimism, I think. There's some dark things that are happening. There's no doubt about it. But inherently, we are good people.
That's great. Let me ask you a really broad question on the First Amendment, which we're celebrating with everyone today. And I know you touched on it a little bit with the freedom of religion, but why is it important that everyone here and all 330 Americans know their First Amendment rights?
Because it's theirs. It's not anybody else's. Oftentimes we talk about these big picture things and it's always somebody else, but really you own it. You have the freedom to express yourself in speech. You own the freedom of religion, whatever you want to practice. If you're a press operation, you have the freedom of the press. You have the right to assembly. You have right to petition the government on your own behalf. And so the beauty of the First Amendment is that it's yours. It's not anybody else's. And once you come to that ownership, there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of power in knowing that you can determine your own future based on that.
Well, Bret, I want to thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. Thank you for all your valuable insights into your work and career. Again, Bret is the chief political anchor for Fox News, and he can be seen at 5 o'clock p.m. I think you guys all know that, judging by your response to him. With Special Report with Bret Baier, he's also the author of the new book, To Rescue the Republic, Ulysses S. Grant, The Fragile Union, and the Crisis of 1876. Bret, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
You bet.